everyone. Welcome back to the second half of the second day of the MPP Policy Lab presentations. We've had 6 presentations so far, 2 more to go this afternoon. My name is Chris Reagan. I'm the director of the Max Bell School at McGill. And let me begin by saying that I am coming to you today from Gimli, Manitoba, which is part of Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe. Many of you may be at or near McGill's downtown campus in downtown Montreal, in which case you're on the traditional territory of the Kanekahaka, which is the Mohawk Nation. But wherever you are currently sitting, and I know that many of you are outside of Canada, I encourage you to know more about the history of your location and to recognize its Indigenous heritage. So what I'd like to do very quickly is just run over the rules. The team will have 30 minutes for their presentation. My egg timer will go at the 28-minute mark. You've all heard it, so I won't repeat it now. Then we have 10 minutes of Q&A from the faculty. We'll have Jennifer, Natalie, and Nick King asking questions. Then we go to the sponsors from ISED, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. And then we open it up to questions from the floor. So without further ado, let's turn to the presentation. The sponsor for this policy lab is ISED, and the challenge is how can the government of Canada mitigate the economic impacts of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations? There is a question of the day, if there ever was one. So Team ISED, please take it away.
This is Nadia. Nadia used to alter clothes as a seamstress for Louis Vuitton's outlet in Toronto, but later decided to move back to her hometown, to Hamilton, Ontario, to start a family. A few years later, Nadia wanted to open her own store that's registered with the government, but no bank would provide her a loan. So instead, she had to borrow money from her cousin to open up Nadia Couture, and has since kept her store running with grants from the Government of Canada. In Nadia's community, the most visible industry leaders are men, so Nadia's had to look elsewhere to build a network to support her. Thankfully, she's been able to lean on some community hubs to meet and learn from other women with small retail businesses. Finding this support is critical for her because the store is how she supports her 2 small children, who often come to Nadia Couture after school, since Nadia doesn't have other childcare options. Despite these barriers, Nadia Couture employs 5 other women, generating economic growth in her community. This is Bella from Mirabel, Quebec. Bella bakes and sells treats from her home kitchen, where she takes care of all of the front-end and back-end duties of her business with no outside help. Working at home allows Bella to look after her toddler, since she's a single mom who's still waiting for a daycare spot in Mirabel. While Bella has some loyal clientele in the community, who often rely on her to make custom cakes that the big food chains don't offer, Bella's having a tough time hanging on to her business. Because it's not registered with the government, she's not able to qualify for many supports that would be incredibly helpful. For example, she knows she could build up her clientele by starting a website, but Bella doesn't qualify for any government grants that would make it easier for her to pivot digitally. She's tried to figure out how to build a website on her own, but there are way too many resources to sift through on this topic, and she's struggling to find what's relevant for her. Because of these challenges and the limited support to fall back on, Bella has a heightened awareness of the risks involved in any decision she makes for her business. Based on the experiences of Bella the Baker and Nadia Couture, you can see how women's entrepreneurship in Canada is not just a strand of public policy, but rather an interconnected web of broader societal factors that determine public policy at the macro level, stakeholder organizations like support hubs and capital providers at the meso level, and of course, individual entrepreneurs and decision makers at the micro level. Now that we understand the ecosystem for women entrepreneurs in Canada, let's talk about our mandate. Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada called for interventions that enable an inclusive pandemic recovery for vulnerable populations in the country. In light of the gendered impact of the pandemic, especially on women-owned businesses, we elected to help women entrepreneurs, particularly vulnerable ones like Bella and Nadia. Today's presentation will proceed by us examining the barriers that Bella and Nadia face in the ecosystem, existing programs that support them, why we must act now, and finally, our recommendations for how we can facilitate a resilient recovery for women entrepreneurs. Our recommendations will be geared toward ISED, but also apply to other stakeholders in the ecosystem. With that, let's recap the problems. As you can see in the ecosystem, there are barriers women entrepreneurs encounter at every level, even when they're left out of the ecosystem. At the broadest societal level, Bella and Nadia encounter barriers like visibility for their work, accessing digital tools, and a lack of affordable childcare that adds to their resource constraints. One step down at the organizational level, we saw how both Nadia and Bella's businesses were affected by a lack of access to capital from financial institutions that carry systemic biases. We also saw at the organizational level how Nadia was excluded from many networking opportunities that would have been key for building up her clothing shop. Finally, at the individual level of the ecosystem, we saw how Bella, trying to figure out on her own how to digitalize her business, experienced information overload, a deluge of information in the digital age that makes sorting through everything to get to the relevant stuff complicated. We also saw how all of these systemic issues contributed to her higher awareness of risk that affected the decisions she made about her business. Importantly, all of these barriers at the societal, organizational, and individual level are compounded for women like Bella, who have unregistered businesses because these entrepreneurs are excluded from the ecosystem entirely. They're also compounded for diverse women. For example, Indigenous women entrepreneurs have reported that digital literacy classes, usually offered in English and French, are inaccessible for them. So let's take a step back. These are the barriers and they are formidable. However, the government has made some progress in addressing these barriers through the establishment of something called the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy.
Federal programs are important in furnishing resources and funding for women entrepreneurs. The Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy, launched by ISED Canada in 2018, hopes to double the number of registered businesses like Nadia in Canada by 2025 and add up to $150 billion in GDP. There are 4 main programs that launched by ISED Canada. The first program is Women Entrepreneurship Fund, a program that provides capital and business advice to women entrepreneurs. Another program is Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, a program that provides funding to 10 regional hubs to increase networking and make the ecosystem more inclusive. Recently, ISED also launched the Say It Be It campaign to cross stereotypes by uncovering how systemic biases create barriers. More than anything, it celebrates successful women entrepreneurs who serve as role models to other women. Finally, there is the Ecosystem Fund, a program that promotes networking and mentorship opportunities. So how does it work? The strategy currently supports 75% of provincial programs focusing on women entrepreneurs because only 4 provinces currently have independent programs for women entrepreneurs. The strategy focuses on increasing access to capital, promoting networking, and providing business advice. It is also important to analyze the policy landscape in relation to the barriers. The gaps we discovered apply specifically to programs for women entrepreneurs. Currently, all the programs are only targeted at registered women entrepreneurs like Nadia. Based on our research, Ontario is the only province that provides childcare support specifically to women entrepreneurs. And there are only a few programs that offer digital supports to women entrepreneurs. Moreover, only 2 provinces try to improve the visibility of women. But we are glad to see that most provinces offer programs to address lack of access to capital, networking, and business advice. It is not surprising because these 3 are also the same goals of the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy. All these programs were promoting women's entrepreneurship until Canada was hit by COVID-19.
The COVID-19 pandemic rocked the policy landscape and exposed the cracks in the ecosystem, as existing programs were not designed to deal with such a crisis. Moreover, the pandemic's consequences were gendered, as it unleashed a secession that challenged those like Nadia and Bella and intensified the barriers historically faced by them. For example, the pandemic shut down operations of brick and mortar stores to an unprecedented degree, furthering the digital divide for many women entrepreneurs like Bella, who didn't have the tools to go online. The eligibility requirement of emergency government funding program meant women entrepreneurs in Canada had less opportunities to access capital in comparison to men. Moreover, BIPOC women entrepreneurs like Nadia faced increased difficulties as they are historically excluded from capital networks. As schools and daycares closed their gates, family responsibilities were disproportionately taken up by mothers like Nadia and Bella. These responsibilities, on top of other things, meant they had less time to run their businesses. Finally, an explosion of duplicated resources from multiple stakeholders overwhelmed the entrepreneurs across the country, especially women entrepreneurs who are historically excluded from informal networks that cut information overload. Overall, the pandemic and its impact on women entrepreneurs confirmed that one size can never fit all.
The pandemic was difficult, but it also presented women with new opportunities. Because of the recession, the problem faced by women gained coverage all across Canada. The pandemic also increased the visibility of women by highlighting many stories of their leadership and resiliency. At the same time, we must be careful because stories that feel good do not mean anything unless they turn into solid action. The pandemic forced digital adoption. Due to lockdowns in Canada, many women like Nadia had no choice but turn to digital tools. This increased digital adoption by 10 times the amount it was supposed to be over the next 5 years. Moreover, through e-commerce and remote work, women in Canada were promised a brighter digital future. On the other hand, digital adoption also came with problems. Many women, just like Nadia, did not have the money or skills required to use digital tools. On top of that, women running businesses from home often had to work from their bedroom as their children or husbands occupy the working space at home. Finally, and unfortunately, the United Nations also reported increased domestic and sexual violence during the pandemic as well. As such, when thinking of opportunities, we must be careful. Networking. Networking events are a crucial tool for intergenerational knowledge transfer, which provides a huge opportunity for women entrepreneurs with less experience to learn from the best and avoid information overload. During the pandemic, many older entrepreneurs decided to retire earlier, taking with a wealth of knowledge with them. There's an opportunity here to capture that knowledge more easily, as social media, digital marketing enabled faster networking during the pandemic. At the same time, networking requires time and effort, and women tend to prefer in-person networks. The opportunities and threats from the pandemic apply to many other groups as well. So why did we focus on women entrepreneurs like Nadia and Bella?
Given the right skills, tools, and diversity of ideas, we often quit our jobs to start something new. Faced with a financial crisis, we often find new ways to make money to provide for our own. Ladies and gentlemen, that's been the story of entrepreneurship since the new millennium here in Canada. As you can see, though, systemic forces have historically determined the realities of those like Nadia and those like Bella. At the same time, we accept that many of the barriers to entrepreneurship are also faced by men, especially by those men who experience public policy differently. However, tracing back, it is clear that we have failed to close down the gender gap in entrepreneurship. One reason for this is that existing policies, as you have heard, only target registered entrepreneurs like Nadia in the green, who make up the tiniest group of entrepreneurs in the country. Even then, closing down the gender gap just between registered women like Nadia and registered men still promises billions of dollars in economic growth. But what about the largest group of women entrepreneurs like Bella, the baker, in yellow? Is the market failing by not capturing their economic value at a time when governments cannot balance their books? Indeed, the same applies to men, and as such, we must think critically about who we consider an entrepreneur. Staring at the yellow part of the graph tells us just how much of the gender gap we can close down if we formalized and recognized the role of those like Bella. And more importantly, just notice the difference between registered men and unregistered men, and notice the difference between registered women and unregistered women. As such, let us think critically about Canada's women entrepreneurs, where they work, and what services they provide. That looks complicated, but we'll do this together. Let us start from the top. 7 out of 10 women entrepreneurs operate unregistered businesses, and only a fraction register their businesses. For those unregistered, a majority are prevalent in the health and social assistance sector, 22%, which is currently statistically classified to include women who are chiropractors and even women who run food banks. Now, the second largest group of unregistered women entrepreneurs are classified under other services, which is classified by StatsCan to include anything from babysitters, car mechanics, nail salons, and even caterers like Bella the baker. Now, in comparison, if we shift our attention to the right side, looking at the green boxes, most women like Nadia operate in the retail sector, which we often hear in the headlines, and in the goods sector, which is mostly agriculture. Currently, the government of Canada designs interventions to address the needs of only those in the green, ignoring the largest category of women entrepreneurs like Bella the baker, many of whom, by the way, organized essential informal services that kept you and me safe for the last year. Before we move on, we must also take note that over 95% of those in the yellow and over 90% of those in the green are micro entrepreneurs operating micro firms that employ less than 20 workers. As such, we must place our focus on micro firms like Nadia Couture and micro entrepreneurs like Bella the baker. But is the federal government ready to do so? What did the budget say this year? Canadian women entrepreneurs are important to Canada's economic success, but women still face unique and systemic barriers to starting and growing a business, and they remain underrepresented in the economy. The pandemic has disproportionately impacted women, and the government is committed to supporting Canadian women entrepreneurs. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of Canada has substantiated what we have worked on for the last 7 months by highlighting the realities faced by Nadia in the budget this year. At the same time, we must remind ourselves that those who are not even part of the ecosystem, like Bella the baker, continue to face harsher consequences even today. But before we unlock the ecosystem for Nadia and Bella, there are some cross-cutting considerations we must keep in mind. With the federal debt skyrocketing, we cannot throw money at the problem. We must choose the right targets and design surgical interventions that address diverse needs that vary from coast to coast to coast in Canada. We must avoid complicated changes that push us apart and focus on fixing micro problems faced by a nation of micro entrepreneurs. We have no room to expand the bureaucracy, and the only way forward is cross-collaboration. Cooperation between the public and private sector, collaboration between government agencies, and coordination between our jurisdictions. Bold thinking is our policy, but the tools are already there. And as such, we must think critically inside the box. Who is an entrepreneur? How do they experience public policy? How can we service them better? How can they thrive in the new normal? What are we forgetting? These are the questions we must answer today to unlock an inclusive ecosystem for women entrepreneurs. So how do we unlock this system?
I'm sorry, Anil, we cannot unlock an inclusive ecosystem without recommendation 0. As we've highlighted throughout this presentation, existing definitions do not account for solo or unregistered entrepreneurs. That's why we recommend the Government of Canada classifying unregistered businesses owned by women entrepreneurs as women-funded to include more women in the ecosystem. The inclusion of the largest group of women entrepreneurs in the government's books promises huge economic gains in a post-pandemic Canada, but only if we also consider unregistered businesses. Next, as we discussed, Statistics Canada categorizes a meshwork of services, for example, food banks, nail salons, and doctors, under groups that are so broadly named. So we recommend ISED work with Statistics Canada to reorganize industry classifications for the social assistance and other services sectors. We need to do this to better reflect the diversity of each sector and inform future interventions for entrepreneurship.
Detailed data is essential for good public policy. Right now, the Government of Canada does not provide publicly available data on self-employment that is sufficiently granular. For example, how many Filipino women in the country have unregistered business? How many Chinese women in Canada have registered business? We don't know right now, and because we don't know, it's difficult to design targeted interventions that address different needs. That's why we recommend ISED Canada work with Statistics Canada to disaggregate data on entrepreneurship with a gender and diversity lens. This has been done before. California recently disaggregated data on healthcare disparities to account for 21 ethnic groups, a granularity that revealed key cracks in the health system. We think looking at entrepreneurship data in Canada in this same careful way can reveal important gaps too. Speaking of gaps, race, and gender, we also encourage the government to establish a gender-based analytical tool for use across Canada. Right now, an analytical tool called GBA Plus The gold standard is used in some provinces to evaluate how programs and policies affect women and diverse populations. But the problem is some provinces use other types of analytical tools or use nothing at all. We should encourage all provinces to adopt a uniform GPA Plus framework to better serve diverse women entrepreneurs. Along this vein, ISED Canada should work with the Women and Gender Equality Canada to mandate fully immersive training in how to apply GPA Plus to all employees involved in regional programs on women's entrepreneurship. This training should come in the form of course number P004 GPA Plus in the policy cycle, a 30-hour training in GPA Plus that's currently only offered on a limited basis to high-level bureaucrats. Providing the training to everyone is key to secure an inclusive ecosystem. We think the important change out of the way. How can we unlock the ecosystem?
Let's go back to Nadia for a second. Remember how Nadia really wanted to build a network of support, but had trouble finding the right resources? Remember how Nadia had to seek out different government grants in order to keep the doors of her shop open? The problem for women entrepreneurs like Nadia who are seeking support is that they're burdened with assuming responsibility at every step of the process. Clearly, we need to streamline resources in the ecosystem and place a focus on the system's users like Nadia and Bella. Now, generally, the interactions between decisions made by Nadia at the micro level and resources offered by stakeholders in the ecosystem culminate into three broad things: money, mentorship, and advice. If we can figure out how to bring those three things together, we can take a step toward an inclusive ecosystem. That's why we recommend that ISED Canada supplement existing grants and loans with mentorship opportunities. This can happen by working with key stakeholders to incorporate prompts for mentorship into existing funding applications, and also by harnessing opportunities for intergenerational knowledge transfer via pairing retirees with up-and-comers. By linking funding and mentorship in a streamlined way, ISED Canada can support Nadia and all women entrepreneurs like her to flourish in the new normal. In Western Canada, the Women's Enterprise Initiative, funded through the Western Canadian Regional Development Agency, offers loans combined with ongoing mentorship, business advisory support, and access to skills development and training. The model we are proposing has been established and proven in 4 Western Canadian provinces, and as such, it should be emulated across Canada. Now, how do we future-proof the ecosystem? Simple, we build on an existing platform. Currently, the Government of Canada's existing platform, called the Business Benefits Finder, as you can see here in gray, streamlines funding applications into a single platform. We want to expand on the gray with the yellow, to bring together funding and mentorship in a one-stop manner. The yellow represents integration with mentorship databases. So if Nadia is applying to a fund through the existing platform, our model will also prompt her to connect to a mentor, as you can see in the yellow. This would work because the back end of the system we're proposing would connect to databases such as ISED's See It, Be It, which is a growing repository of successful women entrepreneurs across the country. So to recap, we want to extend existing capabilities by integrating the existing processes with relevant databases containing information on women entrepreneurs. This new and improved, easy-to-use online platform would cut through information overload and enable any woman entrepreneur to quickly identify relevant programs that serve her needs. Now, let's think bold. Over the long term, this could grow into a full-stack platform driven by artificial intelligence and behavioral science that offers on-demand support in real time for women entrepreneurs. Women who are timed and priced out of entrepreneurship could benefit from this digital personal assistant. Dynamic applications offering on-demand services have exploded during the pandemic, including a very popular wellness app called Noom that uses artificial intelligence combined with real human connections. On a daily basis, Noom nudges 45 million users into making better decisions to keep their health on track. Because the new normal is here, we think these real-time nudges can help women entrepreneurs make better decisions with their businesses too. The future is digital, everyone, but at the same time, digital technology can take on diverse forms.
Without increasing access to diverse forms of technology, we will be restraining businesses in the new normal. As such, we need to think critically about how we can incentivize the use of digital tools. During the pandemic, many micro-entrepreneurs like Nadia put their own money on the line to ensure their businesses survive. And they have survived, exhibiting resiliency and a competitive spirit to navigate out of the crisis. The time is ripe to support these entrepreneurs through a $1,000 tax credit for subscription-based tools to businesses launched right before the pandemic. These tools include Zoom payment application and even marketing platform. The cost of these tools pile up over time and can make it difficult for micro entrepreneurs like Nadia to thrive in the new normal. Now, part of accessing digital tool is knowing how to use them as well. Imagine an Indian restaurant that has an old menu and people are not visiting the restaurant anymore after the pandemic because the new restaurants have menus and content that are built to attract millennials from Facebook and Instagram. Now, if the owner of the restaurant who is not tech savvy and will retire in the next 5 years is able to connect with a trained young person who helps her, we could unleash her true potential. The same could be said for Bella the baker who tried to build a website but could not do so. There is a nation of students currently waiting for jobs, ladies and gentlemen, and the Canada Digital Adoption Program has identified that. By pairing tech-savvy students with entrepreneurs, we can facilitate intergenerational knowledge exchange and help thousands of businesses adapt to the new normal. Now, the Digital Adoption Program has good intention, but we are not sure if the young students have been made aware of the systemic biases in the ecosystem. As such, before being assigned to work with women, we must ensure our young digital consultants are made aware of the biases so they can help the women entrepreneurs to the best of their abilities. Now, thinking about the supply side of the program, we also urge the government to invite unregistered tech-savvy women entrepreneurs who run freelancing businesses on the side to be considered by the program in order to unlock the ecosystem for those unregistered. Of course, many of the things that I talked about require the internet. Now, what about those who don't get internet? Ladies and gentlemen, 4.5 million Canadians, many of whom live in indigenous communities, are vulnerable in the digital economy because they don't have even access to the bandwidth required to join a Zoom call just on audio. For far too long, we've been trying to wire the knot, but we have failed to do so. So let's forget the wires. Currently, American companies like SpaceX and Canadian companies like Telcel have internet satellite legally roaming around Canadian airspace and can provide internet services on demand with subscription fees less than $100 per month, ladies and gentlemen. While the government continues to build on vital infrastructure to enable essential services like health and education, we should also enable last mile internet connection to promote entrepreneurship hubs and community centers in rural areas. One way to do this is to increase cost sharing for technologies like Geo and Starlink. Ladies and gentlemen, none of our recommendations forget about the rural-urban divide, and this one, especially this one, cannot. We have unlocked many parts of the ecosystem, but there is one very crucial factor that we are still missing.
Ladies and gentlemen, how could we forget that Bella and Nadia are mothers? This is exactly what happens when we think childcare is a broader societal factor. Women are timed and priced out of entrepreneurship. Childcare services are usually designed around the 9 to 5. Now, the pandemic has turned up the volume on the conversation, and it is time we extend this conversation to women entrepreneurs. A childcare provider is just as important as a university or a bank because they can make or break Nadia or Bella's entrepreneurial dreams and journeys. As such, before legislation on childcare is tabled this fall, ISED Canada must immediately urge the government to invite women entrepreneurs and experts on women's entrepreneurship, many of whom are in attendance today, to the National Advisory Council for Childcare. Now, building on that, how can we include care providers in the ecosystem? As you know by now, ISED Canada funds 10 regional hubs, like Chunhong said, across the country. In an old-fashioned way, one afternoon, the team sat down and mapped out the nearest childcare centers to each one of those hubs and started thinking critically inside the box. While solutions for childcare can be complex, we found one way to go about it without reinventing the wheel. Let's look at a regional hub in Ottawa that's currently funded by ISED programming. You follow the arrows and just listen to my voice. If ISED Canada incentivizes the hub to work out an arrangement or incentivizes the licensed care provider to enable free or subsidized childcare to women like Nadia and Bella, we can go a long way in mitigating the economic impacts of COVID-19 because they can attend the sessions they were timed and priced out of. Ladies and gentlemen, while the bigger conversation on childcare goes on, we are not here to take sides today. This is not a model that proposes to build new centers, or neither is it one that offers lump sums of money. It is a surgical need-based model that enables those who need care to access it when they need it the most. And that has been the story today. Smaller fixes to complex problems. Ladies and gentlemen, entrepreneurship is complex, and a complex web of policies, perceptions, and views make it even more so. But by cross-collaborating on surgical interventions that focus on micro-entrepreneurs, we can unlock the ecosystem and prepare women entrepreneurs for the new normal. But nothing will move forward without better data and broader definitions. We have to expand our gender and diversity lens. We must focus programs on the user and make the ecosystem more inclusive. We must incentivize digital adoption to harness the promise of a digital economy. And finally, we have to extend vital supports to women entrepreneurs. Our recommendations not only make the ecosystem more inclusive, but they also uphold our global commitments for UN SDG 5, 10, 8, and 17. They also respect the right to equality under Section 15 of our very own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Ladies and gentlemen, 1 year ago, we were supposed to celebrate the 25th anniversary for the Beijing Platform for Action on Gender Equality. Instead, COVID-19 unleashed a she session that rolled back decades of progress for women and women entrepreneurs. Truly, at this time, there is no going back.
We have to unlock an inclusive ecosystem for Canada's women entrepreneurs.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, team. Great presentation. Nice graphics. All right, we are going to turn to faculty. Nick King is first, then Jennifer, then Natalie.
All right, I'll go first. Thank you very much for a very engaging, interesting, and clear presentation. So during your presentation, you stressed the importance of micro level and surgical intervention. So my question is going to be fairly micro level and surgical. It strikes me that your recommendations, while I take them all to be extremely smart, don't match up very well with the largest group of the people that you intend for them to impact. Now, by the data that you have presented, 22% of unregistered solo women entrepreneurs work in healthcare and social assistance. You know, a lot of these are sort of home healthcare workers. They're taking care of people on a one-to-one basis and not necessarily looking to grow a business like the two examples that you provide at the beginning. Another 16% work in the other category that I think you astutely say it would be useful to disaggregate. And I'm trying to figure out how fixing data and expanding definitions, streamlining business supports, and particularly your emphasis on the digital arena. So expanding wireless or wired access to the internet, providing digital apps and tools, hooking people up with virtual or real mentors is going to help this large group of women who are essentially, though we might call them solo entrepreneurs, are doing one-to-one caregiving. So how are you going to help that group of people? How are your recommendations really going to give a leg up to this group of people?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. King. I can start us off, and then I'm sure my teammates will pitch in. So I think when we started off the report, it was all about registered women entrepreneurs. And we quickly noticed after analyzing 20 years of Statistics Canada self-employment data that we have a problem. And the problem is exactly what you identified. But I think the issue is when we are analyzing the healthcare and social assistance sector, right now, it's such a meshwork. We not only have, let's say, chiropractors, we also have those solo women who are providing, let's say, care at home, but we also have, folks who are running food banks, who are running nonprofit organizations. Now, many of the recommendations we considered build on first recognizing whether or not if they are an entrepreneur. And I think once we recognize that, we can then figure out whether or not we're designing interventions for for-profit enterprises or for nonprofit enterprises. Now, our report specifically defines entrepreneurship as the pursuit of creating economic value and generating economic value with a profit-making motive. But in hindsight, when we did our research, we also realized that many of the policies we offered can be transferable. But I think the first and foremost thing we need to do is figure out whether or not we can start including these unregistered entrepreneurs. But there will be a point in time when we decide whether or not whether we decide to focus on for-profit or nonprofit organizations. Now, having said that, many of our recommendations inside the report, particularly some of the ones that has to do with government tax schemes or increasing business registration, all of them talk about unregistered women entrepreneurs and how we can prompt registration through many of our recommendations. So I'm sure Hannah, went over that system, which we mapped the journey of the user. In that system, the government of Canada already provides prompts to registered businesses, but we emphasized on providing extra prompts along the side here and there and fixing also the language, because I think we also have a visibility problem where if you Google entrepreneurs right now, the picture you get will not really express the views that we shared today. So part of increasing the visibility of women entrepreneurs and including prompts for registration and changing words like entrepreneurship, or maybe explaining words like entrepreneurship better, can actually help us register women entrepreneurs, whether they want to apply for tax credits through their corporate taxes, or whether they want to apply for tax credits to even their personal income taxes. But for that, I think the first and foremost step we need is for the government to recognize if we are, considering unregistered folks as part of the ecosystem. And then the next step is recognizing whether we're focusing on for-profit or nonprofit organizations. And the step after that is recognizing what nonprofit organizations mean when you're operating solo. Let's say you're part of a social movement versus you're operating a business, like an organization with employees.
Okay.
That's sort of the steps.
Thanks. So Nick, if you've got a follow-up, please let me know in the chat box and I'll come back to you. Can I go to Jennifer now, please, for a question? And I think we may have to keep these answers a little bit shorter if we're going to get through everybody.
Okay. Hi, team. Great to see you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm going to sneak in two questions. I have lots, but I'm going to ask you two. One is more specific, and it's around your ideas about recategorizing women entrepreneurs and giving them particular IDs. And you had a very kind of granular set of IDs around ethnicity. And I think you were drawing around on California for that, Filipino, Chinese. And I'm just wondering if you see risks or potential downsides to categorizing around kind of one ID marker, perhaps imposing similarities of one kind, but overlooking other kinds of similarities that might be more relevant to what you want to do. That's the first question. The other is, we've heard a lot the second question is, we've heard a lot in your presentation and also others about this need to coordinate. And I wondered if you considered the incentives that might exist not to coordinate. The lack of coordination sometimes exists for a reason. And are there incentives out there, either among government jurisdictions or particular actors, not to coordinate, that need to be expressly overcome to move the dial in this policy space? I know that's a big question, but you're a smart group, and I'd be really interested to hear if you've thought about that.
Yeah, so I'll start tackling the first part of your question, Dr. Welsh, this idea of why we're pushing for this granularity in data, and is it perhaps sometimes better to kind of take a more comprehensive picture, and are there potentially downsides to revealing some of these granularities? And I would say to that, number one, we are of course, privacy concerns and data protection is first and foremost. So that's certainly something we would always want to encourage entities to keep in mind. But one reason why we're really interested in this idea of looking at the granular picture, and as we kind of talked about with the California example, is that it can really give a textured understanding. So just to give a little bit more context to the California example that was brought up, prior to 2016, California only used 10 categories of ethnic subgroups to look at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Following 2016, after a law was passed, 11 more categories were used. So you had a total of 21 ethnic subgroups that were identified. And only after that could the state start to see, okay, we have 8% of Japanese Americans who have health insurance, 27% of Korean Americans. How do we bridge these gaps? And so, while we always want to keep in mind data protection, privacy protection, and understanding the lay of the land, we do think there's value in also pushing for that granularity, and we don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Natalie, and I'm going to put Jennifer's second question into the open session. So Natalie, can we go to you for your question, please?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, team. I'm curious about the Women Boost platform that you shared and you spoke of briefly in your brief based on the Kiwi example or the New Zealand example. And I wondered how and who might be the best organization to be responsible for that. And I'm wondering where the responsibility blends between the role of ISED in supporting women entrepreneurs and the role of the BDC in providing advisory services for women entrepreneurs. So, and I was just wondering if you thought about those two different organizations that all fit within ISED, but perhaps one better suited to provide the support that you're proposing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Natalie. And I think all of us will pitch in quickly to answer this one, or as many of us can. Essentially, I think the first problem was figuring out whether women entrepreneurs will need this. So initially, we wanted to do like, a survey with a sample of like 10%, but that was a little hard given our time constraints. So we talked to other organizations who have done similar surveys, especially ones that focused on whether or not women are getting mentorship for the tax dollars. And I guess that's when we realized that many of these opportunities lie outside government, right? Because the mentors, the 1,000 women entrepreneurs that the government holds a repository of, they are not government employees, and they are part of the private sector, and they're also part of the broader public sector. Now, when designing this tool, the one thing that we always mentioned was that the tool is already there. So there's something called the Existing Business Benefits Finder, which actually is not launched by BDC. It's launched by ISED Canada, and it works with other databases across, the federal government, to integrate funding applications into one platform. So the capacity is already there in the government. It's fairly new and it has been introduced in the last 6 months. But we want to build on that by connecting them to mentorship and entrepreneurship. And then in the future, we want to connect it with behavioral science and nudges, which is where again and again, we have said that none of these things, they will be very difficult for ISED to lead or do alone, and we must call in private sector stakeholders and entrepreneurship hubs. And as such, I think if Hannah wants to add something on the behavioral piece, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned Noom during my discussion, and Noom is sort of a health and fitness app that uses AI and behavioral science to supplement its functions. And so essentially it'll nudge its users based on information they inputted previously about their diet or their exercise, how they can make better decisions that day moving forward. And so that's kind of a picture of what we could also transfer to the entrepreneurship realm when we're thinking about, what supports have women previously relied on and how can those be utilized to narrow down future supports that they look at, rather than, the user, again, being burdened with assuming responsibility at every step of the process, trying to find information, trying to find what's relevant for them, and then trying to figure out how to apply and move forward. I think Shahid had a word.
Yeah, just one small point that I would like to add, because the pandemic has really shown us how important is the digital presence and digital adoption in times like this and for the future too, because there is a question of resiliency. Some of the businesses have survived and they have definitely taken on the digital route. So I think building on such a platform would would be helping in future coordination that we are talking about. There will be a whole of an ecosystem approach. The ecosystem would be like helping women entrepreneurs who are entering into it, and multiple stakeholders would be at one place to helping them.
Okay, I'm now going to turn to questions from ISED, and I've got Hillary Blake in the chat box. Hillary, if you could let us know your question.
Yep, I just wanted to briefly touch on the sort of the concept of regional differences, right? So we're going to, as a federal department, we always have to design our policies in keeping in mind that they're going to actually be enacted in very different communities that look very different from coast to coast to coast, like you mentioned. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what do you see as the interventions that could possibly have the most place-based impact in terms of driving outcomes that have the most regional sort of concepts or lenses in mind?
Yeah, I think I can have a go at it. I think one of the most important thing that we've been talking about in our recommendation has been mostly tilted towards those regional or surgical angle that we've been. So one of the things that we have already highlighted, that there are regional hubs that are working, and also there are regional advisors, innovation advisors that are working for entrepreneurs. So we really believe that there is and also like we talked about including the childcare providers into the ecosystem. So all of them, they have been thought through on a basis that is local basis, so that we can provide the access at local level. Even talking about this digital tool that we talked about in our recommendations, that also goes to tell you when you put your geographical location at certain place. So it's going to give you resources which are geographically available. So I think connecting funding, mentorship, and networking, all three things that we have talked about, and all our recommendations, that they are all geared towards taking care of that localized angle of those policies, so that they are effective and they cross barriers that are there due to regional differences. And also the internet thing that we talked about, we have also talked about the rural-urban divide and how we have to reach. Like, we understand ISED Canada has programs that are trying to take care of that, like Innovate to Connect program that is taking care of the internet side. But still, we believe in addition to the essential services, we have to take care of the local problems that exist in rural areas, so that we help those hubs or entrepreneurs who are working in rural areas. So that's how our all recommendations are designed.
And just connecting this back to Dr. King's question, I think when we start addressing needs at the local level, we also start focusing more on the solo entrepreneurs who are regionally scattered, providing essential services often. And I think when we talk to the innovation advisors across the country, it was a different experience talking to them versus talking to the regional development agencies that employ them, or even talking to the program that sits in Ottawa. And I think at each stage, we realize that there are little incremental changes we can make. For instance, let's say if somebody's applying for a tax credit and they don't know how to do it, the innovation advisors often come in to help in that process. But now, training them in the right way and ensuring that the innovation advisors are aware of some of the systemic biases that are present in the ecosystem, we could go a long way in mitigating the impacts of COVID-19. So we must be accounting for the urban-rural divide at every stage of the process, because we often see women more marginalized in areas that have less internet connectivity. And some of our recommendations address that.
Okay, thank you, team. I'm opening it up now to the general audience, and I've now got 4 names in front of me, or 4 names on the list. So at the top of the list is Camilla, and then on deck is Gina, and then I've got Nick, and then Jennifer. So Camilla, please take it away.
Thanks very much, team. It's a great presentation. You talked about advanced gender-based analysis plus training course for entry level and for regional analysts. So I wonder how could this training be different from the free online course for that trains for entry levels that the government already offers?
Yeah, so the 5 of us have already got together and took the 2-hour GPA plus courses one night. And however, the next day, if someone like tests me on the courses, I would have failed. So because it is simple, and if we did macroeconomics for 1 or 2 hours, and then we were told to explain monetary policy, that Chris will not be happy with our answer. So if we studied for 30 hours of lecture, then we would actually aim for better public policy. So it is similar, like if the government provide longer, the 30-hour training and the 30-hour and fully immersive training, not only for the high-level bureaucrats, but for everyone, then we will think that we will have empathy with women entrepreneurs and then better solve the systemic barriers.
And just to briefly add on that, you can establish robust metrics, but unless you have robust training, it's very difficult to ensure you have people working on the ground to have kind of a framework to be able to modify programs and adjust different realities in real time to best serve all women entrepreneurs, right? You need that knowledge base. And this kind of fully immersive interactive training, it's been implemented before actually in the country of Uruguay in their capital city of Montevideo. Some of their public servants got together and created a fully multi-day immersive interactive training program. And, we've seen great results there. And we think Canada should, be willing to take that step and invest in fully training as well as and alongside, establishing metrics.
And just a small.
Yes, Shahid?
Yeah, just a small point. Like we have been hearing this a lot from our stakeholders, because they've been talking about the GPA plus has been like being implemented at a policy formulation level. ISED Canada is taking care of it. But as soon as it goes to the field level, the implementation level, so that is not being observed that way. So I think training those people, like Chun Hong said, that's very critical for the effective implementation of GPA plus.
Okay, I just got a follow-up question from ISED, and I'd like to slip it into the speakers list. So I've got something in the chat box from PSC. So if you would ask your question out loud, that'd be great.
Are you able to hear me?
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm having technical difficulties, and apologies for the delay in the question. I didn't actually hit return. It's just it builds a little bit on a couple of questions that have been asked already, and sort of the regional question. If we're in the identified gap you had for unregistered businesses, and your recommendations for program redesign on the intake side, how are we going to reach those women entrepreneurs who really aren't aware about the benefits in registering their business or taking advantage of programmings? Like, it seems to me we can make it easier and simplify and try and find platforms that are easy to use, but how are we going to reach those business, those unregistered business, to encourage them to come to government for help?
Thank you so much for your question, Paul. And I can start answering it. I think the first thing that we have noticed throughout this time is when we want to reach unregistered entrepreneurs, it all ties back to the macro level barrier of visibility. And I think the first question one person often asks themselves is, am I an entrepreneur? And what does entrepreneurship mean? Does that mean that I have to be registered with a business number across the country? So in regards to that, I think as part of each of the recommendations, I think, for instance, recommendation 0 would help understand which of the people from the health and social assistance sector and from the other services sector can we actually consider as entrepreneurs? Because right now, because they're aggregated together, we can't seem to, understand the difference between the number of people who are, operating food banks versus the number of people who are running nonprofit care services. That's recommendation 0. Recommendation 1 would essentially inform regional level analysts they would be basically more informed because of advanced gender-based plus training. And I think being aware of those like barriers and using terms like entrepreneurship, when someone can just say, hey, are you running a business by the corner? Do you bake goods? Do you know that these are some loans that you can apply to? That would be a big step in the right directions, because we have seen the private sector do that by enhanced marketing that focuses on explaining jargon into little stories. So instead of calling it entrepreneurship, we just call the person a businesswoman or the person who makes cookies and sells them. And I think that's another step. For recommendation 2, I think when we're talking about streamlining existing services, in the report, we outline how existing mentors who often know many unregistered women entrepreneurs will also be incentivized to become mentors to those mentees. Now, that's another way when we can start bringing more people into the fold through active communication between both target groups from the supply side and the demand side. And now for recommendation 3, and when we talk about digital adoption, that gets a little tricky. We're not going to lie. But I think even for the tax credit, I think in the report, we go over how, if the government considers, and if the evidence we presented is okay, then we might consider introducing that $1,000 tax credit, not just for corporate income taxes, but also personal income taxes, but do that as $500 first, and then another $500 upon registration. And then finally, for recommendation 4, that is actually interesting because we do have a demand and supply problem for childcare in the country right now. And I think we will need to figure out who is unregistered and registered first before we start linking it to a broader public policy factor. So in that regard, we can still advertise free childcare services if women are attending entrepreneurship opportunities at the mentorship hubs. So it could be addressing the problem from the back instead of the front instead, right? So those are some of the ways.
Anil, thank you. I'm going to cut you off. I apologize. We are absolutely into the lightning round now. I have 4 minutes left on the clock and we've got 5 questions. Gina, you are up. This needs to be a 15-second question and a 30-second answer. Gina, then Nick, then Jennifer, then Tara, then Eleanor, and we're probably not going to make it. Gina, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for the presentation. So the question I have, I put it in the chat, but it's related to validating data from the bottom. I was wondering if you got the chance to conduct a survey, or how did you manage to understand what women entrepreneurs really need and want? And if so, how was translated in your proposal? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can take that. Thank you, Gina, for the question. Actually, we had thought about it, but we didn't have the time to do the survey of the women entrepreneur from every province. So we have interviewed the people who've been working on it, and we have also relied upon their surveys that they have conducted. For example, the Women Enterprise Organization of Canada conducted 2-phase national surveys to analyze COVID impacts. And I looked at it, and when we also compared it with the other surveys conducted by PayPal and Visa, and the data in the State of Women Entrepreneurship report conducted by ISED 2 years ago. So by looking at all that data and analyzing it and doing the cross comparison, we were able to identify and validate what are actually the needs that are, what are the needs of women entrepreneurs.
Okay, thank you. Nick and Jennifer, who actually is AKA Eleanor in the chat box.
And I'm AKA Iris. I'm also tried to rename myself, but couldn't. So that's the kids at home Zoom condition. All right, lightning round question. Policy is conducted usually in an environment of scarce resources. So if you had to pick one recommendation that has to come first, or is the only one that can be implemented, which one?
Love that question.
Recommendation 0, nothing will move forward without better data and broader definitions. We need to do that first and foremost for any of our other recommendations to reach their full potential. Thank you.
Okay, Jennifer or Eleanor, whoever is closest to the microphone.
Yeah, sorry, Eleanor is my daughter as well. Somebody's changed me, thank you. I want to just go back to my question. How do we understand the barriers to coordination and overcoming the incentives for people to remain in their silos in order to make your recommendations work?
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think we can build on this through the example of childcare, where we're seeing a lot of back and forth between the provinces and the territories and the federal government right now. I think, there's usually two ways to do like cooperation and collaboration from my little knowledge about it. One is through encouragement, motivations, and partnerships. The other is through coercion. And now, I think right now we're at this point of time with premiers balancing their books. The federal government does have a light opportunity to push a little bit on adding conditions and adding perspectives to some of the agreements that will take place. For example, the bilateral agreements that the federal government will be signing with every single province that has to do with childcare. I think we have some room there to input perspectives or insights of women's entrepreneurship so that at least it's considered when the people are sitting in the room and talking about it. Now, of course, there will be pushback. There was always pushback. There was pushback when we made our health cards. There will be pushbacks going forward. But I think the pandemic has opened up this conversation and opportunity about coordination, because we have repeatedly seen that having a bird's eye view from Ottawa is not solving the problem. And I think as we forge onwards towards these important bilateral agreements, we must not only keep women entrepreneurs in mind, but we must keep COVID-19 in mind, and we must keep climate change in mind as well, because the satellites Shahid talked about, they run on energy, they're energy efficient. We have an opportunity. It's just about pushing the issue into the agenda, and there will be pushback, and we know that. And the pushback will usually be around transfer payments. And I think we can work around that if we introduced perspectives to all leaders across the nation.
Okay, I'm going to draw it to a close there. Nayantara, I apologize for not getting to you. There will be pushback. Those can be Anil's famous last words, and of course, famous words that apply to any good policy initiative. There will be pushback. Thank you, everyone, very much for attending this session. Thank you to ISED for sponsoring this policy lab. Luc Vallée, you're out there behind the scenes coaching this team. Thank you very much for doing your part. And of course, the team itself, Hannah, Changhong, Yutin, Shahid, and Anil. Thank you, great job. We are taking a break now, and we are back in exactly 1 hour for the final session of the day. So thank you all, and see you in an hour.